context growing up, we think a lot about learning through listening. The really weird thing about making podcasts and making YouTube videos, especially if you're working alone, you're not doing an interview, you're not doing a roundtable format, is that you do a lot of learning through talking. I do not script my videos. Sometimes I get email from people who assume these videos are scripted. So no, it's 100% off the top of my head, spontaneous. But you do a little bit of thinking before you come on camera where you think, okay, what themes am I going to address? How am I going to combine them? How am I going to get this whole discussion done under 1 hour, under half an hour, under 15 minutes? You go through a very strange process of learning through talking in making YouTube videos, in making podcasts. And even though I have done well over 400 YouTube videos at this point, I think we crossed the 500 line a few days ago, guys. 500 uploads at any rate. Making the videos on A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, it's remarkable to me how different the process is for me, mentally, creatively, or what have you, of putting together a video like this, in contrast to the videos I've done about real-world politics, ethics, history, and of course, animal rights, veganism, ecology, the other themes you're going to see discussed on this channel. I have other videos about learning languages. I have other videos just talking about my own life, etc., etc. But it really is interesting. So in this video, I'm covering a couple of different topics. But one big theme. The theme I really want to talk about in this video is the contrast between psychological realism and political realism. And basically, my thesis here is, from my perspective, my opinion, is that the enduring quality of the Song of Ice and Fire book series is that it presents you with a world that has this kind of profound political realism. It has enough social complexity, has enough social contradictions, that it pulls you along as a reader. It certainly pulls me along, despite very often a lack of psychological realism. And I don't really mean that as a criticism. I think if the books had more psychological realism, they might be boring. Is Ramsay Bolton psychologically realistic? No. It's just left up to your imagination. At several times I think this has happened at conferences, at press conferences, or book promotion events. George R.R. Martin will comment that none of the characters in the book are truly good or truly evil. And then someone will say, well, wait a minute, what about Ramsay Bolton? And George R.R. Martin will kind of vaguely say, well, you know, he had a bad childhood. And the audience will laugh. So I think that's happened at least twice. You can find that on YouTube, at least one of the times when he's made a joke of that kind. Dismissing the idea that even Ramsay Bolton is a simple evil character in his nuanced world of characters that are neither good nor evil. Now, would these books be better if instead of presenting Ramsay Bolton to us in this stark, simple way with great economy of language, if instead we delved into his childhood psychology, his relationship with his mother? A lot of American fiction, whether in cinema or in script or in book form, is really loaded with, it's heavy with that kind of attention to psychological realism. And for me, from my perspective, I like the fact that Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, is not, that the books are not burdened with that kind of psychological realism. Now, okay, I realize some people are going to still regard this as a criticism. For me, it's part of the economy of language, and I think it leans on the political realism and the reader's propensity to fill in the gaps with plausible explanations for why the characters are doing what they're doing, that we fill in the gaps with plausible motivations when we often know nothing about the characters. So another example, really rapidly, really quickly. Kevin Lannister. We get one chapter that gives us a little bit of psychological realism to Kevin Lannister. Not a lot. A little bit of his psychology is shown to us. But up until that one chapter, in which he dies, by the way, #spoilers, we have no idea who this guy is. And we don't need to know. I don't think a single person read these books and before that final appearance thought, you know what? I just don't understand Kevin Lannister. I just don't understand his political motivations. I don't understand his psychology. Who is this guy? Who is this mysterious Kevin Lannister? We don't need to know. We don't need to know because Kevin Lannister is presented to us as coping with these complex scenarios in such a politically realistic world. And for me, there's a very moving scene. Many of you may not think of this as emotionally moving, but this reflects my own background in caring about politics, war, history, etc. You know, Kevin Lannister sits down with Cersei at one point. I forget, honestly, if they're sitting or standing. It's immaterial. And Cersei She isn't even really threatening him. It's just a situation of a rather vague, unstated conflict between Kevin Lannister and Cersei Lannister. But there is the real possibility of the conflict between Cersei Lannister and Kevin Lannister descending into a Lannister civil war. And you can imagine how different the whole story would be, how different the whole, history, fictional history would be if they had taken in that direction. And Kevin Lannister says to her, this is from memory, but as I recall, he says, I have a good fortress, I have a good castle, and I feed 200 knights. He says, we can't win. If it's this civil war, if Cersei really comes for him, he can't win. He said, but we can really make you fight for it. It won't be easy for you. There's going to be a significant body count. This is going to be a war that's going to go on for a long time if you really want to take it there with me. To me, that scene has so much gravitas, so much reality. And as I recall, Cersei is quite surprised. She didn't think these negotiations were gonna go that far. She didn't think she was going to be in that life and death face-off with Kevin Lannister, but that is what they're discussing at that stage of the plot. Is there psychological realism to it? No. Do I need there to be? No. For me as a reader, I'm already completely pulled in and in a sense committed to following the story because of the political realism of the overall context. Now, so this video, although it's going to talk about a few different things, some of you reading the title of the video, you may already want to know why I'm bringing in some commentary on the Boiled Leather Audio Hour podcast, one of my other podcasters who talks about Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones. I think the other big thing I want to talk about here is revenge and the significance of revenge in these books as a whole. Now, look, as a kind of strange disclaimer, I'm not talking about subtext here. I'm not talking about a topic of speculation. The idea that revenge is an important moral, ethical theme in these books is written very clearly. It's put into the mouths of characters. It's expressed in the text, not in the subtext. Not a matter of interpretation. I think it's significant, it's self-evidently significant that we have the enormous importance of revenge down in the southern tip of this fictional world, down in Dorne. We have these characters in Dorne who are almost cartoonishly obsessed with revenge to the point of their own self-destruction. And we have this very memorable monologue or dialogue reflecting on how hopeless revenge is, and especially drawing attention to the fact that revenge has no clear endpoint or outcome. When is it enough? When is the cycle of revenge done? How destructive and self-destructive this yearning for revenge is. So that's in the text, not in the subtext. That's in the southern end of the world in Dorne. And then almost mirroring that, at the northern end of the world, we have Barbary Dustin. Barbary Dustin, another character who, again, her obsession with revenge, is irrational to say the least. Barbary Dustin, why does she hate the Stark family? It's a very romantic tale in 2 sentences. She loved her husband. Her husband went off to war on a red horse. Her husband promised her that he would come back alive from war on that red horse. But ladies and gentlemen, that is not the kind of promise you can expect a man to keep. War is hell. Nobody knows who's going to live or who's going to die. And her husband died. It's not Ned Stark's fault, but Ned Stark brought back that horse to her without her husband. She was bitter as hell. She could never forgive him. She deeply hated Ned Stark. Not only did she vow to destroy the Stark household, which she has done. She's already accomplished that. That revenge is in the past tense, But after Ned Stark is dead, it's still not enough for her. She's got to destroy his bones. She's got to prevent him from having a proper burial. And she's got a network of spies to help her carry this out. This is ridiculous when you think about it. I mean, we already know Littlefinger has a network of spies. We know Varys has a network of spies. Now what? Now Barbary Dustin has her own private CIA. And none of these spies managed to find Arya Stark, right? None of them can find her, but her spies are on it. Her spies are going to track down the bones of Ned Stark. And why? For revenge. Now, obviously, for me, this is one theme I'm discussing in this video. It may seem to you I've mentioned 3 or 4 different unrelated things. Is this psychological realism? Is this lacking psychological realism? I really think in many ways George R.R. Martin's approach to writing these characters reflects his own prior success as a horror writer, as an author in the horror genre, and really the American genre of horror in that genre, the single most overweening influence being Edgar Allan Poe. We have a lot of characters that fit into that tradition of Edgar Allan Poe's over-the-top villain seeking revenge, often for no rational reason or no stated reason whatsoever. And seeking revenge in a way, if you think about your own life, your own real-life experience, I doubt any of you have met a character out of an Edgar Allan Poe story. It's evocative, it's dramatic, but it is not realistic. Again, I'm not complaining. But in the real world, your experience with revenge is much more likely to be two people at your office who hate each other bitterly, and they wait all year until one day at the Christmas party, they've both had too much alcohol, and they yell at each other about how much they dislike each other, and this hatred comes out. This is the reality of revenge in our lives. It's petty, and it may be cruel, but it's the type of yearning for revenge that leads Doran Martell to, in effect, kill his own son. I mean, he doesn't quite kill. He sends off his son on this impossible mission, resulting in his son's death. Ridiculous. And many people, including Preston Jacobs, are trying to reinterpret this in some other way. What it is showing us, not in the subtext, in the text, is how this yearning for revenge dooms their whole house. That is the story of House Martell. It is not portraying revenge in a morally neutral way. This is if anything, in A Song of Ice and Fire can be called a fable. This is a fable about how revenge is bad and evil and wrong. And George is, in this context, laying it on thick. Barbary Dustin, I think, is more nuanced, etc., etc. But George, as I said, even with somebody like Ramsay Bolton, George is not really interested in giving us this kind of icing on the cake of psychological realism in the American tradition. I prefer it that way. I don't need to know. I do not need a rational explanation or a psychoanalytic glimpse into the mind of Ramsay Bolton and why he does what he does. I don't need it for Barbary Dustin either. We're kind of given enough of a dotted line, and then the rest is we get to see these people coping with realistic hurdles, realistic political conditions in a world that has this compelling political realism to it. So even if some of the characters are, to be blunt, a bit like cartoonish supervillains in their pursuit of revenge, for me, that does not impair the story. And I would say, now, I'm not planning to write a novel in the near future. It is possible I will. In the next 3 years, I'm living in some strange... I can imagine writing a novel in the next couple of years, given the circumstances I'll be living and working in. If I were to write a novel, for me, I would take that as a very kind of positive lesson from George's success. I don't think he came to this in a carefully thought out way. I think that George's success as a writer of horror, because he's an award-winning horror author, and prior to the enormous success of Game of Thrones, you have to remember his writing with horror was some of his most successful writing, financially and otherwise. He and some of his books combine elements of horror and science fiction. There is a story called Sand Kings. It's not his most famous work. Sand Kings was both successful as text, and it was adapted into basically a TV movie. I think it was a 2-hour TV special. If it's a 1-hour TV special, I apologize. But anyway, Sand Kings, most of you have probably never read Sand Kings, no offense. Sand Kings, again, is a story where definitely, almost the main character at least, very much that Edgar Allan Poe tradition of just being an inexplicably malevolent, vengeful character from page 1. And we get no examination. We don't know anything about his childhood. We don't know why he's like this. We don't know what his objectives are in life. We don't know why he is so cavalier about killing people and getting revenge. And that's there from the alpha to the omega, from the start of the story to the end. He's just that kind of guy. So that I just say this is an element of George's writing that for him, from his perspective, I think has been rewarded. I think his horror writing is something that met with a pretty large audience, very positive public reception. And I think that has influenced him as a writer to have more and more of those characters and more of that pattern. Now, the other thing that I think is very interesting, looking at A Song of Ice and Fire as a whole, looking at all the books together as an epic, and at this point we have maybe 50% of the books published. If you think we're 75% of the way through the story, maybe. It seems like we're at about the halfway mark. As the year 2016 comes to an end, this is the last couple of days of 2016. I'm recording this in, by the way. It seems to me the story is about halfway done. I think George is tremendously interested in revenge as such, and he has an explicitly ethical and political view of revenge that in some cases is harshly damning of revenge. Revenge as a concept, if you like. But he also challenges himself. I'll say what I mean in a second. It is impossible, so we've alluded to earlier, George does not like to categorize his characters in terms of good versus evil. But you can very easily categorize the characters in terms of motivated by revenge versus not motivated by revenge, which becomes very interesting very soon. So obviously, Jon Snow, so far, not motivated by revenge. Nothing Jon Snow has done up to this halfway point, up to his apparent death, up to being stabbed, is motivated by revenge. We don't know. When Jon comes back from the dead, maybe that's a fundamental change. Maybe he wants revenge against the Night's Watch. We don't know, right? But Jon, up to this point, you can say has been a morally good character, at least by this one criterion, in that he is not motivated by revenge. Now, Jaime Lannister, again, a morally gray character. Most people see him as being on a redemption arc. In reality, we don't know. We don't know what Jaime's going to do next. At the beginning of the books, I'd remind you, there's this tremendously odious atmosphere surrounding Jaime Lannister and all of the knights who are in the immediate company of the king, who at that time is, Robert Baratheon. You have this sense of them being violent men who have no purpose in life, who have nothing to do in this world in between wars, right? Jaime Lannister and the Hound and the other members of the King's Guard, the King's Coterie, they just seem like a malevolent bunch of bored members of a biker gang who are itching for any excuse to fight, any excuse to kill someone, including the killing of Micah the Butcher's Boy, right, which is done by the Hound, as you'll recall. But before any of that happens, from the first time these guys walk on stage, there's a tremendous sense of menace. Dare we say evil about them, right? But nevertheless, Jaime Lannister, as we first know his character at the beginning of his story arc, Jaime Lannister is not motivated by revenge. Why did Jaime Lannister kill the Mad King? For the good of the realm. Why did Jaime Lannister destroy these other houses, fighting on the side of, House Lannister, fighting on the side of House Baratheon to some extent? For the good of the realm. Jaime Lannister is not out for revenge at any point in the story. And when you look at that, okay, that puts him in a totally different category from Barbary Dustin, from the whole of House Martell, which is, all these ridiculous characters in House Martell. I mean, I'm sorry. Look, if anyone here is offended that I'm saying House Martell lacks psychological realism, did you, the first time you read about the Sand Snakes, I mean, I've heard comments on the internet, the Sand Snakes are like an all-female team equivalent to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, okay? No, there is no psychological realism to the Sand Snakes. Don't kid yourself. And there's no psychological realism to the role revenge has in their life. So again, they're like these Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Each one has a different superpower, a different weapon or whatever. It's the Justice League or the X-Men. I guess the X-Men is maybe a good comparison. Each one has a different superpower. This one's a religious figure. This one's a warrior. It's junk writing. I'm sorry. And all of them are obsessed with this revenge for events that happened before they were born, events that were not in a meaningful sense part of their lives, etc., etc. That's how we're introduced to them. Zero interest in examining their psychology, their motivations. They enter stage left as villains chewing up the scenery. And now, of course, another example like that from the South is Darkstar, the infamous Darkstar, the most hated character. Many people feel that's the worst written character or worst written couple of scenes in the whole series of Game of Thrones. Okay, George R.R. Martin is not perfect. Sometimes I think we could say the lack of psychological realism is a problem. But for me as a reader, because I really respond to the political overtones and political undertow of this story, it's not much of a problem. Maybe for someone else it would be. Maybe for someone else looking more for that American tradition of, frankly, digging into everybody's, Freudian past, Freudian psychoanalytic history. Maybe they would be more frustrated with this book series because it never gives you that, right? It never even gives you that for Jon Snow. I mean, with Jon Snow even, you're just left filling in the blanks for why this guy is the way he is. And, I think it would be a lot less interesting if we did dig into all that stuff. All right. Who is motivated by revenge and who is not? I think, so again, you could go through a list of all the principal characters or even all the minor characters. and look at who is motivated by revenge and who is not, and you get a much more useful set of categories than good versus evil. Another very interesting one, no doubt, is Tyrion Lannister. For the first half of his story, roughly, first quarter of his story, Tyrion Lannister, again, is not motivated by revenge. Even though Tyrion Lannister is an amoral character at best, or an anti-hero, why is he fighting against Stannis? For the good of the realm. Why is he fighting on behalf of House Lannister? For the good of the realm. Tyrion is not motivated by revenge in any sense. So I think it's interesting to say that up to a certain point in his story, in that by that criterion, he is morally good, despite the many evil and odious things he does. And then we have a change. For one thing, he actually does take revenge on his own father. He both wants revenge, and he seeks revenge, and he gets revenge immediately. And that's not enough for him. It's a bit cartoonish, but after he leaves King's Landing, he wants revenge on his own sister. He won't be satisfied. We were told this again and again, and it's easy to ignore. He has a monomania with murdering his own sister. He is out for revenge. Okay? Make no mistake, in the book, Tyrion Lannister is not trying to liberate the slaves of Meereen. He couldn't care less. Tyrion Lannister is not trying to save the realm from Stannis Baratheon because he believes Stannis Baratheon is a bad or evil king. Other characters are. His own brother, Renly, it's very interesting. Renly sets down that his reason is that he thinks Stannis will be a terrible king. Varys is really afraid. If Stannis becomes king, it will devastate the realm. And we don't have any reason to think that was a cynical ploy. Overall, it seems that Varys was speaking sincerely when Varys said that from his perspective, Stannis must be stopped. Stannis is in effect a threat or a menace or would be an evil and terrible king. That's not Tyrion's motivation. After Tyrion leaves King's Landing, he is out for blood. He is out for revenge. And he has become another one of these, again, broadly speaking, in the tradition of Edgar Allan Poe, very psychologically simple, bent on revenge, destructive and self-destructive characters. Now, I think when you see it that way, that also foreshadows, maybe to some extent, what is coming next for Tyrion. Yeah, I think there's actually a lot for us to consider there. Okay? Now, so 2 challenges now. I think it is very easy to say, in a sense, that Littlefinger is an evil character. If you look at the storyline of the fake Arya, as we call her, the woman who replaces Arya Stark at Winterfell, and it's very unclear what's going to happen in her storyline. It's one I don't want to try to predict what happens next. But, if you look at what Littlefinger did to fake Arya, just to use that name, unbelievably, needlessly cruel and evil, takes this girl and reduces her to being a prostitute, and that's before even she's married off to Ramsay Bolton and so on. Littlefinger knows what he's doing, and this is seemingly an evil act with no particular plan or purpose to it. And we're reminded of that, I think it's in the sample chapters, but at the very end of the plot, after Theon and fake Arya escape, Theon warns her. He says to fake Arya, you must maintain this illusion. You must keep on using this fake identity, because if not, your true identity is equivalent to a whore. You'll go back to just being a prostitute if you admit that you're not Arya Stark. Now, we have no idea what's going to happen in that plot. Apparently, that character is going to lose her nose. So that's 2 different characters, major or significant characters who have their noses cut off. Apparently, due to frostbite, she's going to lose her nose. I think it's quite possible that actually the real Arya Stark will not want to resume her identity as Arya Stark and will allow that woman to continue to be Arya. It's quite possible in the plot. We'll have a noseless fake Arya, ruler of the North, which is a type of nuance and subtlety you do not see in the TV show. But anyway, we have no idea what's going to happen with that storyline. But Peter Baelish's role in that, Littlefinger's role in that, it is very easy to call that evil. However, Littlefinger is not motivated by revenge, or so far in the books, this is December of 2016, so far, not that we know of. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe really the final judgment on Peter Baelish in these books will be that he was motivated by revenge. Maybe what we'll find out is that from day one, he just wanted to kill Ned Stark because he could never be satisfied until he took revenge against the family and the feudal system that deprived him of the opportunity to get married to the only woman he ever loved. Catelyn Stark. Maybe Littlefinger's story really is a revenge story. Maybe that's what gets revealed, in the next 2 books, 3, however many books we've got. Maybe. But right now, it's also possible to look at all the evil and terrible things Peter B.L.A.H has done and say, hey, he was doing this for the good of the realm. Yes, he was also doing it for his own career, for his own advancement, to get rich. Yes, that too. But, Ned Stark showed up at, in the first books, Ned Stark shows up in the capital city, and Peter B.L.A.H is there to help. He didn't need to be. He could have been there trying to get revenge from day one. Maybe what's revealed is that he always was. Please don't bother to send me hate mail on that. Maybe. We don't know. So I think even using this set of criteria for not good versus evil, but characters who are motivated by revenge versus not motivated by revenge, it's interesting that some, at least at this time, are in a gray area. But anyway, obviously, House Martell is an extreme. Their revenge is what their story is all about. And then mirroring that in the far north, Barbary Dustin is just about revenge. I think there is a sense in which you can say Theon Greyjoy is illustrating, the opposite side of the coin or something. What does revenge even mean? Doesn't it become meaningless in Theon Greyjoy's story? What does justice mean? Is it justice for Stannis to execute Theon Greyjoy and so on? We don't know. Obviously, Jaime Lannister is also showing that flip side of the coin. Would it be justice for Jaime Lannister to be killed because he killed the Mad King, or for these other things? We have the totally surreal situation of the Hound being put on trial for killing Micah the Butcher's Boy, which is, I think most people overlook just how significant that is to the ethics and morality of this saga as a whole. He's put on trial, and he says he was only following orders. He was standard operating procedure. That was his job as a soldier for the king. Don't blame him, blame the king. And he wins at his trial. They have a totally surreal, supernatural trial, and he's found not guilty, right? So I do think these are kind of deep, and the theme of revenge, it isn't just deep. It's on the surface of the text also. Again, you don't have to get into subtext, you don't have to get into interpretation, but it's there in almost every part of the story. Now, the final point I want to make on this issue, and again, for me, I'm reflecting on this dynamic contrast between psychological realism and political realism. I think that what's coming up in the storyline in Meereen really relates to this also. Now, look, guys, let's pause to talk about real politics and real history for a minute here. Some of you may have never read real historical accounts of slave rebellions, of slave revolts. They are incredibly gruesome chapters in the history of our world. I do not know what George has read, but I assume he has read several real historical examples of slave rebellions, slave revolts, slave revolutions, and that this shapes his writing of what's happened in Meereen, Daenerys Targaryen's storyline. One of the most extreme, the most gruesome, the most dramatic is the revolution and counter-revolution in Haiti. So Haiti today is an independent country. They fought very hard for that independence, and they fought hard against France. And even though France had a revolution of its own, a revolution that cynically used the concepts of freedom and ending slavery and what have you, the reality is that the French, under Napoleon, tried to force Haiti back into slavery. To simplify so, they tried to force Haiti back into being their colony. Now, slavery in Haiti itself was especially cruel, especially inhumane. And the contrasts were the other islands right next door. So at that time, before the revolution, everyone in Haiti knew, and by the way, it wasn't called Haiti at that time. Haiti is a later name. But anyway, we're using the name Haiti to avoid confusion. Everyone in Haiti knew that slaves were treated better in Cuba. There were these contrasts between these different slave-owning colonies. They were all slave societies, but slaves would actually run away from one slave society to be a slave in another society just because the conditions of slavery were better in one place versus another, right? So even when the Caribbean was basically completely filled up with different slave societies, the differences in the treatment of slaves, the differences in the human rights of slaves, if you like, the relative degree of oppression and cruelty was something that everyone in the business was aware of, right? So they knew, okay, in this country, this is how a slave on a sugar plantation is treated. In this country, this is how a slave who works in a tailor shop is treated. There was a very complex scheme of the different levels of slaves within one society, in Haiti, tremendously complex, by the way, which is partly to encourage the slaves to oppress one another and to get the slaves to buy into the system, so to speak, so that every slave could feel that they were in a better situation than some other slave who had it even worse than them. But also there was this contrast between the different slave-owning countries. So Haiti was an especially terrible slave society in a period of history when slave societies were common. And everybody knew it. It was not a secret, right? And their rebellion was an especially violent and extreme rebellion when it came. So somewhat sarcastically and somewhat seriously, when the slaves rose up and had their revolution in Haiti, and by the way, actually there were several Haitian revolutions, but we're simplifying, in what's referred to as the Haitian Revolution, you will see books and even illustrations showing so-called the banner of the revolution. When the slaves rose up, they didn't just kill the slave masters. They didn't just rape and kill the slave master's wife. They would murder the babies, the children of the slave master. And it was, reportedly, from all the history I have read, it was a common sight to see the armies of the rebel slaves, the slave rebel armies, marching from one town to the next with a spear and an impaled dead baby on the end of that spear. So a white baby, the slave master's baby that they had killed, would be skewered on the spear and held up to show negotiations are over, right? It was a life and death struggle. And so that this is not a one-sided picture of the barbarity involved, you may or may not know the first use of gas chambers in the history of the world was done by Napoleon's side, in trying to turn back the clock and trying in the counter-revolutionary war. In the holds of ships, so these were giant wooden ships that would have a big, empty wooden space in the bottom, the hold of the ships, they would put hundreds of people into the hold of the ship and use the crude poison gases that existed at the time that would kill you pretty gradually. And they executed thousands and thousands of people this way in gas chambers. So in the history of the world, the first use of gas chambers in crimes against humanity, you could call this genocide, but anyway, it's mass murder, was by the French side in fighting against this revolution, this revolution and civil war, this attempt to get freedom from slavery for the people of Haiti, right? So the history is extremely brutal. And again, so if you have any sensitivity to that, if you have any connection to that, and that is not the only history of slavery I'm familiar with. I've read the history of slavery and of rebellions against slavery in several different countries. Many Americans seem to think that the American Civil War is the only or is the standard history of how slavery gets abolished on this planet. It's not. It's a very unusual situation. I mean, fundamentally, the majority of people fighting in the Civil War were white. So this was one group of white people. Obviously, some black people were there, but this is one army of white people fighting another army of white people to debate whether or not they're going to own slaves. That is in no way comparable to a situation where, in extreme poverty and oppression, the slaves themselves rise up to take on the moneyed establishment and take on the slave owners directly. A slave revolution is very, very different from what Americans saw in their historical experience in the U.S. Civil War, right? So my point is, the level of brutality seen in Daenerys Targaryen's struggle with the slave owners, it does have political realism. Whether or not there's psychological realism is another question. But what Daenerys does is that she comes into power on the promise of abolishing slavery. Her only legitimacy as a foreign conqueror, as an army of occupation taking over the city, her only legitimacy comes from her claim that she is going to carry out this type of revolution. It's a slave revolution. And again, I do think George has some background in studying some of these real-world slave revolutions. So in a sense, he knows what that means. It means, if you want to use the comparison to French history, it means the guillotine. It means the society actually eliminating the ruling class, actually slaughtering the slave owners. And we have that issue or that option presented to Daenerys again and again. And I think it's very clear up to the point we're at now in the books, Daenerys is refusing to have a regime built on revenge. She is not wanting to rule a city that's built on the logic of the slaves rising up and taking revenge against their former slave masters. For her own ethical and political reasons, she refuses this, she refuses this. Many people give her blunt advice on this. And I just say, I think to understand what's going on, you need to go back and reread what Barristan Selmy says very, very carefully. I think fundamentally Barristan Selmy is telling us the truth at many points in the story. He's not playing games. He's not telling Daenerys what she needs to hear. And she's often ignoring what he says. And then we get to see Barristan Selmy's investigation. It's a little bit like a detective story where Barristan Selmy figures out who is conspiring against who, etc. I think what we can understand, especially if we put enough weight on Barristan Selmy's exposition, Daenerys has left this revolution incomplete and undone, or it's only half done. She started the revolution and she didn't finish it. Halfway through this type of slave rebellion, she changed her policy entirely. She sold out all her principles. She sold out the interests of the slaves. And not only did she try to negotiate with and compromise with the slave-owning elite, she actually tried to marry into their class. She started wearing their clothes. She arranged a marriage to one of their, aristocrats. Now, from the slaves' perspective, this is a betrayal of their interests beyond imagining, right? But this is also simply abandoning, the only raison d'etre for her regime. Now, the point we're arrested at in the story, the cliffhanger we're at in the story, is seemingly of Daenerys having to embrace the ethic of fire and blood. Okay, this is a little bit vague. I think it's much less vague when you look at this in terms of the meditation on revenge seen throughout all of the books. I think we could say that the fable of Meereen is in many ways saying, even if your leader is this somewhat jejune, somewhat naive teenage girl, which is what Daenerys is, she's not out for revenge. She wants to be reasonable. She wants to negotiate. She wants to compromise. She's even willing to get married to someone she doesn't love. She's willing to get married into a culture she doesn't respect and become a member of a social class she doesn't want to be part of. She is willing to meet them halfway for all these, good and noble reasons, peace and prosperity and cooperation and compromise. But the setting she lives in is one of political realism. It's one in which the people want revenge, and her only legitimacy comes from satisfying the desire for revenge from those slave classes, right? The legitimacy of her rule cannot come from a noble marriage to Hisdar Zolorak. Sorry if I get the name wrong. Hisdar, I'm sure about. It cannot possibly come from her courting the support of the green grace of Meereen, of the local religious authorities. It cannot, right? It's only coming from the ground up. It's coming from that same place she was at when she was walking on the road to Meereen, and she was seeing the corpses of these children, these child slaves that had been tortured to death, that had been executed just to intimidate her, and she wanted revenge. So why does George set this up? I think, in a sense, he's challenging himself as a writer. He's challenging us as the readers, as the audience. He's challenging the overall morality that's unfolding in this book, the morality tale. The point of the morality tale in, Dorne is completely obvious to everyone. There's nothing subtle about it, right? Revenge is bad, very clear. Meereen, by contrast, is showing you can fight against it, you can obviate it, you can try to avoid it, but this desire for revenge is also part of political reality. And sometimes it's ineluctable. And someone like Daenerys Targaryen, who seems like the most powerful person in the world, is powerless when confronted with these choices between either giving the people what they want, which is revenge, and tearing a whole society apart just in order to stay in control of it, liquidating the ruling class, as so many societies have done at the revolutions. But again, Haiti is an extreme example, but a telling example. Really, the revolution in France is also a very telling example, and those two revolutions ended up at war with each other as the French wanted to reclaim their colony. Terrible irony in history. Napoleon thinks of himself as a revolutionary, thinks of himself as representing the ideals of the revolution and of freedom and all these fine ideals, and he was fighting to try to force Haiti back into being a slave colony of France, right? That's real history. In case you think A Song of Ice and Fire is hard to believe, it's pretty unbelievable that really happened here on planet Earth, right? So this is what I have to say. I mean, I think that again, I'm not criticizing him when I say that the strength of the story is in political realism rather than psychological realism. I mean, I do not find even Daenerys Targaryen psychologically realistic, and that's fine with me. I don't care. But for me, the political realism can carry the story. I think, I mean, if you ask, why is revenge so important throughout this whole book? I don't know, you tell me book 1, chapter 1. I think it's book 1, chapter 1. You have the stag and the direwolf, the literal stag and direwolf that have killed each other in the forest. So the two houses, the most obvious symbolism in the world. Why? Why have all these houses torn themselves apart, right? To a large extent, A Song of Ice and Fire is a critique of feudalism. I mean, why does Barbary Dustin need revenge to the extent that she does? Barbary Dustin's title, it's the same, by the way, with the Reigns of Castamere. The Reigns of Castamere, which is not in the books yet, maybe it never will be, but it's alluded to in the books, and then we know about it from the the World Book. The story, the tragedy of the Reigns of Castamere and the tragedy of Barbary Dustin is ultimately based on the fact that this is a social system where your marriage defines land ownership, defines your wealth and your status and your political power. Sure, there's a huge, on a macro level, the whole story is a condemnation of feudalism itself, root and branch. It's a condemnation of people having political power based on their birth and land ownership based on birth and marriage, etc. Sure, on a deep level, that's there all the time. But I think it's also showing us with absolutely no ambiguity that the problem is, what animates this whole tragic state of affairs is no doubt the desire for revenge. That's always there. Barbary Dustin can never be satisfied. House Martell can never be satisfied. And in some way, the whole feudal system, I think, is illustrated, again, partly because of these ultimately economic moorings, the economic basis of the feudal system. It is prone to, or it ineluctably leads to, this unending cycle of revenge. And again, House Blackwood, I'm sorry, I may be reflecting, we have these two houses. What is it? Oh, God. So I'm getting to Raven Tree and Blackwood. Oh, God. I did not prepare names. We do have these houses that we see through Jaime Lannister's eyes. And so one of them, their house sigil is this giant black weirwood tree, trying to destroy each other over centuries and centuries. In microcosm, that's giving us the same story that these books show us in macrocosm. Their desire for revenge between those two houses never ends. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting if it's Black Tree or Blackwood. And they're at this bizarre, there are these two hills that are referred to as Barba's Teats. You guys will know what I'm talking about. If you've read the books, you know what I'm talking about. And Jaime Lannister learns the whole story of these two houses who have been at war with each other for centuries and centuries. Why is it that they can never have enough revenge? It's really shown to us. This is not subtext. It's explained to us in the text. Their desire for revenge can never end because this cycle of seeking revenge is linked to who owns the land. It's linked to the struggle to control grain fields and granaries and, the pottery industry and the shipping industry. It can never end. There can never be peace. There can never be into a cycle of revenge because of, in a sense, the way the feudal system links to this ugly aspect of human nature. And to make the books dramatic, that aspect of human nature is made even uglier because so many characters come straight out of Edgar Allan Poe. Enough said. In case you hadn't noticed, the vast majority of videos on this YouTube channel are about politics. So I'm a guy who primarily writes articles about politics, records podcasts about politics, records videos on YouTube about politics, including the politics of animal rights, ecology, veganism, but many other forms of politics as well. By contrast, there is a very famous, very well-respected podcast about A Song of Ice and Fire called the Boiled Leather Audio Hour. On that podcast, they primarily, the main guy there is Sean T. Collins. Sean T. Collins, you're going to hear his voice in a minute. I'm going to play you a clip. Sean T. Collins, he mostly writes about fiction. He mostly writes articles about TV shows, and his podcasts are about fiction, are about TV shows, including, of course, Game of Thrones. and once in a while he talks about politics. So he and I are exact opposites. I talk about politics all the time. I talk about A Song of Ice and Fire once in a while. He talks about fiction all the time. He talks about A Song of Ice and Fire all the time. He talks about politics once in a while. So I'm in a unique position to maybe comment on the recent lapsing of Sean T. Collins into the political sphere. They've had quite a few podcasts, actually, that talk about politics. And apparently shell-shocked in response to the election of Donald Trump. Sean T. Collins went off script, and they did a whole... Boiled Leather Audio did a whole episode. The Boiled Leather Audio Hour did a whole episode just talking about how shocked and horrified they are by the election of Donald Trump. I'm going to play you less than 1 minute of what Sean T. Collins says here, and then you will get my response. I think it is interesting that we have reached a tipping point in the fandom, if I can use the word fandom, where I could do a podcast just responding to other podcasts about A Song of Ice and Fire. So the level of critical engagement with this literature is now so high that it's not just possible for me I could do a meta podcast. A podcast about podcasts, all right? It's not what we're going to do. But I think that is, in a sense, something to be celebrated, and it shows how seriously these books are taken. In this case, I do think it's regrettable that Sean kind of went off the rails, and you're going to see why.
Yes, and I've stayed off of Twitter for the last week and a half or so, maybe even 2 weeks now, in large part, with the exception of occasionally plugging my work and my partner Julia Graffair's work. And I talked about something that we'll get to later in this podcast, which was the role of television and television dramas in particular in the election efforts of the Trump campaign. But the reason I've done that is because of what I have tattooed on my left arm, and I'm not going to try and butcher the German, but it's Wittgenstein, and it says, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. And I don't...
No comment.
Particularly feel that I had anything of value to contribute beyond my initial reaction, which was white nationalism is inherently illegitimate. The Trump presidency may be legal, but it's illegitimate, and there should be no cooperation. Because there should be no cooperation with fascism ever. And it's a neo-fascist movement, and it's sizing up to be a neo-fascist regime.
So, the whole premise of this video you've just been watching, and of talking about the politics of A Song of Ice and Fire, the premise here is that we're talking about politics in the fictional world. And yet, what I find so problematic, so troubling about what Sean T. Collins is doing here is that he is really presenting us with a mix of real politics and fantasy that, I feel he is stepping into a very dangerous realm of fictionalization, shall we say, of real political problems. It's very important for all of us that we remain rigorously honest with ourselves about our beliefs and our values. Not even that we demand of ourselves that we practice what we preach, but that we recognize whether or not the things we believe in are even practicable in this world, if they could be practiced, okay? Now, I've dealt with a lot of politics in Asia, politics in Canada, politics in the Western world, politics within Buddhism, politics in Buddhist countries, politics in communism, extremism, including, mass murder by communist regimes. Probably all of us at some point in our childhood asked ourselves, when we learned about World War II, when we learned about the history of the Nazis in Germany, probably all of us asked ourselves, what would I have done if I was there at the start of this regime? And Sean T. Collins is here really seriously suggesting that the election of Donald Trump is, 1, a neo-fascist regime, 2, a white supremacist museum, he's used the term white nationalist, and 3, that nobody should cooperate with the regime. So presumably this means if you have a job with the federal government at least, if not the state government, from the state government, you should now quit your job. And I don't know, go to the jungle, join the resistance, join the rebellion. If he actually believes, if his beliefs are things that can exist in the real world, if this isn't just fantasy, if this isn't just hyperbole, if this isn't just propaganda, if you really believe this is the start of, quote, a neo-fascist regime, Sean, how are you living your life accordingly? If you even think this is believable, how would anyone live their lives accordingly? To me, this kind of thinking is much more dangerous than mere hyperbole. Okay? It sounds absurd to say, I am not saying this even in support of Donald Trump. I'm really not. I'm really saying this to warn against the tendency to mix fantasy and fact, which is funny because a lot of what we're doing here is taking a kind of politically realistic view of a fantasy novel, right? Sean, I hope in your heart of hearts you don't actually believe that this is true. I hope you're not that out of touch with reality. But I also think you need to think through rigorously if this is what you believe. If you believe that America is now at the dawn of a new, as he says, neo-fascist, white supremacist regime that nobody should cooperate with, how are you going to live your life accordingly? My values and my beliefs in this world is very difficult to live with. I do not own anything made out of leather. This watch has a plastic watch strap. I don't own anything made out of leather because my beliefs and my values entail that nobody should buy leather. That the industry that slaughters animals, that raises cows in a cage made out of steel and concrete, only to die and make products out of their bodies, I think that's immoral. And I have to live my life accordingly. And some people, especially if they're unfamiliar with veganism, they never thought about it, some people think that's impossible. Some people think, whoa, how can you live your whole life without using anything made out of leather, without using anything made out of wool, sheep's wool? Is it possible to have a diet where you don't eat any meat? I deal with it all the time. In Buddhism, all the time I dealt with these kinds of questions where people believed impossible things. People subscribed to a fundamentally supernatural cosmology about what the world is and what's going on in the world. And you'd really have to talk to them and say, look, if you believe in the literal truth of this scripture, ancient Buddhist scripture is what we're talking about here, how can you live your life accordingly? When you meet Christians who actually believe the world is going to end very soon, who believe that the prophecy in the book of Revelation is coming right up in just a couple of years, and there are some famous Christian groups that do believe this, how are you going to live your life accordingly? I remember I heard an interview with a man, and his parents didn't let him go to university because they thought the world was going to end too soon for that. Who's got 4 years to waste going to a university program if the world's going to end? Just get ready. There are people who live with these kinds of impossible beliefs in this world. But I got to tell you, Sean, I have read so many accounts of people, either the people who were communist revolutionaries or the people who were escaping communist regimes when communist regimes were carrying out mass murder against people, where they had to wake up one day and recognize that they were living in a despotic regime, in an extreme or despotic situation, and they had to sell their bicycle and put on their backpack and go walk to the mountains or walk to the jungle and join the resistance, join the Maquis, or what have you. I remember the account I read of one guy who lived in Nazi Germany, and he was opposed to the Nazi regime. And for a while, he opposed them, so to speak, at his desk. And then at one point, he realized he had to flee. He had to run away and join the resistance, join the rebellion. And it was the realest thing in the world. He just commented, he said, "You don't know how precious those bourgeois habits are to you. The rhythm of daily life, until you have to give them all up. Whether it's the little coffee machine he had in his apartment, or just being able to take a shower every day, the comforts you have in your apartment, giving those up forever to go join the revolution, go join the resistance, and probably sleep in a tent and not have a proper toilet and not have a proper shower and not have your coffee machine anymore." Those may sound like small things, but those are hard decisions people have to make. And all of us, I think, again, as children, we had to ask ourselves when we first learned the reality of the history of World War II, even if we just learned a very simplified version as it's presented to children, we had to ask ourselves, if I had been there at that time, would I have had the courage to do what was right? Would I have had the intellectual acumen to realize what was going on and to stand up and do the right thing? Or would I have been a coward? Would I have been a conformist? Would I have just been ignorant? Would I have just ignored the warning signs? What was going on in front of my eyes? Again, I remember another account from World War II of a guy who was in Nazi Germany, and he didn't put the pieces together when the Holocaust was starting. But he reflected on it sadly, he said he remembered he was in a public park, a normal I believe it was in Berlin, and there was a park bench with a sign on it, no Jews. That Jews were not allowed to sit on that bench in the park. And he said, I should have known. He said, even if that was the only thing he saw, he said, I should have looked into it. I should have asked questions. I should have figured it out just because I saw that park bench. You know, he was regretting of us. He felt if he had been smarter, if he had been more curious, if he had been more rigorous, he could have figured out what was going on at that time just on the basis of the park bench. Now, obviously, this guy, so the particular guy was a bit of a fruitcake. I mean, you look back at what was going on at the time, you think, how could you not have known? Well, some people didn't know. I mean, still today, some people are spending all their time playing video games, and they're not paying attention to political reality. Not everyone is as interested in politics as I am. I appreciate that. Some people are trying to find the cure for cancer. It's not that they're playing video games. They're in a lab. They're just studying, biochemistry. Some people are like that, so they don't know what's going on. There's a whole spectrum. There are many, many reasons why people lose touch with what's going on in political reality, and to some extent, I can sympathize. But Sean, this is really a situation where I think you're veering into peddling not just propaganda, but a really dangerous mix of fact and fantasy here. If you believe, as you say, that this is the start of a neo-fascist regime, how would you live your life accordingly? How could this belief exist in the real world for other people? What are you actually calling for when you say that nobody should cooperate with this regime, that nobody should cooperate with the federal government? Do you think that someone employed by the Parks Commission should quit their job, or by someone employed by the mayor's office? What is it you're actually saying here? Because I think that one of the fundamental virtues you must have in democracy is not to dehumanize your opponents, is not to dehumanize the people who you just happen to disagree with. I think the ugly truth is, Sean, that you haven't faced up to yet, is that Donald Trump is not a fascist, is not a neo-fascist. He's just somebody you happen to disagree with. And you know what? Millions and millions of your fellow Americans who surround you every day and who sell you hot dogs out of their hot dog stand and who sit next to you on the bus, or the people who surround you. I mean, a huge number of people did vote for Donald Trump. Don't demonize them. Don't dehumanize them. Don't call them white supremacists or neo-fascists. Obviously, some small percentage of them are. But, this is mainstream American politics we're talking about. I think, you owe it to them, if you're going to dispute with them, to recognize they're not fascists. They're just people you happen to disagree with. And maybe that is a much more humbling position for you to have to adopt, given that you just lost the election, than this somewhat grandiose fantasy that you're facing off against the rise of another Adolf Hitler. But Sean, I think you need to work on separating your fantasy life from your reality life, and maybe you need to separate politics from podcasting. As for my part, my podcast is going to remain 110% political.